I'm from UNESCO, and it's a great, great pleasure to be there with you today. Let me introduce you, and thanks to this amazing panel. We've been talking quite much this morning about very climate-related issues like data, innovation, etc. But now I invite you to move on to a more broader topic by introduce you Elizabeth Cousens, who's a former ambassador who joined the UN Foundation this year, and Mrs. Cousens has been leading the negotiation for the US for the post-2015 Agenda for Development. So I leave you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to see you all here this morning. Great to join you. So 2015 is a really big year. We're on the cusp of a history-making climate agreement, and we've already had a couple of historic breakthroughs. And let me just talk about a couple of them. There was the Financing for Development conference in Addis Ababa in July, where we started to change the conversation about development financing and look at ways that we can harness an entirely new spectrum of capital flows for development. Domestic resources, curbing illicit flows, harnessing private and institutional investments, philanthropy alongside official development assistance. And at the UN in September, world leaders adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and agreed on new global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, to succeed the Millennium Development Goals. These 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, tackle poverty, inequality, and the environment, including climate change. They're ambitious, they apply to us all, and they give the world a to-do list for the next 15 years. And let me elaborate a little on these goals, how we got them, and why they matter. So first, 3 things about the goals. The SDGs are interconnected. We've known since the Brundtland Commission first introduced us all to the idea of sustainable development over 30 years ago, that economic, social, and environmental problems are connected, and their solutions need to be too. We've been living with the effects of systems, policies, and habits that disconnect them, and the SDGs give us a tool to change that. If you want to create long-term food security, you have to think about energy and water. If you want to tackle a whole spectrum of diseases, you have to think about water and sanitation as well as health systems. If you're serious about poverty eradication, of jobs, or inclusive growth, you have got to deal with climate change, which singly could undermine all the development gains that we've made in the last few decades, and you've got to empower girls and women. These are just a few of the examples of the interconnection between the goals. Second, the SDGs are universal. Not every country has extreme poverty at the level that is internationally measured, but every country has poverty, and too many have growing inequality, and every country can lift the floor for their most vulnerable citizens, and the SDGs are a call to action for us all. Third, the SDGs bring in new issues that tackle what we know are key barriers and what we know are powerful drivers of development, like gender equality, like peaceful and inclusive societies, like inclusive growth, and like sustainable energy. So how did we get these goals? Well, when we started trying to craft them a few years ago at the end, coming out of the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, I don't think any of us would have imagined where we landed this year. That we would embark on the most inclusive process the United Nations has ever seen, that the UN and its partners, civil society, and others would engage millions around the world about the world they want to see by 2030, and that we'd get 193 countries along with civil society, business, members of the scientific and research community, faith-based organizations, after arduous negotiations to agree on anything like the 17 goals that we adopted last September. And to do that at a time when the world is complicated, at a time of ferocious turbulence, centrifugal forces, and a lot of distractions, I think that signifies something quite important about the depth and the breadth of the appetite for change. So let me just end with a quick thought. Every problem we face, no matter how complex or seemingly overwhelming, including climate change, has solutions if we harness imagination, innovation, and truly commit ourselves to working together. Ending extreme poverty in a generation, that's doable. Bringing sustainable modern energy services to the 1.3 billion people who currently live in the dark, that's doable. The prospect of an AIDS-free generation, it's realizable. Tackling preventable child deaths, now the minute you even have a category about preventable child deaths, the death of a child that can be prevented, how can you not throw every ounce of energy into trying to achieve it? That's possible. And restoring the oceans, the forests, and the climate on which all of our lives depend, that's also solvable. These are giant potential gains that are within all of our reach. Now, sometimes this seems really complicated, daunting, and every issue we're talking about is clearly extremely complex. But I think it's also, on another level, pretty simple. We've given ourselves this year with the SDGs and with the climate agreement that we know needs to emerge this week, a set of tasks and a giant opportunity to work together in a once-in-a-generation job. This is just the starting gun, and now it's time to get to work. So I look forward to talking to you in the next few minutes.
Right, if you have questions about those major challenges and okay.
I'm Nadeem from Pakistan. I have a very basic question. Should we call it a global goals or GGs or SDGs or Agenda 2030? What the identity we should take from here to the next 30 years?
So to me, all three titles work. The question is what the substance is. It's what the goals are, whether we call them SDGs. They're called Sustainable Development Goals. They're part of the 2030 Agenda. That was the outcome that was adopted in September. We can also call them global goals. What matters is that we start acting on them.
Max from Good, and I'm curious about the accountability of some of these measures. We heard about the open data, and we know there's advances there. But yesterday we heard from Secretary Kerry that binding is going to be difficult politically from the U.S. I thought he was very compelling on all of that, but he also talked about needing accountability. So I'm curious with both the SDGs and the agreement we're hoping for this week, how we can think about the kind of accountability side of it.
So this is a huge question, an important question. There are all kinds of discussions going on at the UN right now about what the formal processes are for measuring, tracking, and convening on a regular basis to see how we're doing, where we're falling short, and what to do about it. But to me, the larger question of accountability goes to, in a way, it goes to demand. It goes to what citizens in every country want from their elected officials, from the people who provide services. It's what the business community needs. It's, again, what faith-based organizations and others want. So if we can sustain the kind of mobilization, awareness, and focus that we've generated this year over the next 15, we will have the tools not only to hold each other accountable, but actually to make sure that we're all delivering in the way that we've kind of promised ourselves we need to do.
Good morning. I'm Raiz Barsha from Philippines, writing for the Manila Times. What is the stumbling block the UN is facing if the SDG program for the next 30 years will not be achieved? And what would be the sanction, or the sanction maybe, for countries who failed to address and pursue the SDG programs?
I think one of the beauties of these goals is that they did emerge from a truly inclusive process. 193 countries negotiated them at the end of the day. And that means they're, on some level, owned by all of us. And where they'll really be measured and results ultimately felt are in all of our countries. So it's crucial what happens at the UN, at the global level, to kind of remind us all the task we've set ourselves and make sure we're on track. But what's fundamentally important is what happens at the country level and at the regional level. So I think it's a really different terrain than the one maybe we've been used to thinking about in terms of where action needs to happen, where accountability is crucial, and as I say, where results will really be felt.
Hi, Elizabeth. I'm Michael Molitor from Sciences Po. I teach here at Sciences Po. Growth is flat today, and we can argue that the Millennium Development Goals weren't reached for a number of reasons. We're having difficulty after 25 years getting agreement on climate change. Let's be honest, growth is the most powerful force on the planet. Growth is flat today. The French government requires 3% GDP growth year in, year out to generate enough revenue to pay for its social system and pay down its sovereign debt. It announced GDP in the last quarter of 0.2%. Okay? Let me be provocative. We've got the lowest short-term interest rates in history. We have the ECB purchasing 60 billion euros worth of assets a month in its quantitative easing program with absolutely no stimulus. Is it possible that this new era of anemic growth is not being driven by capital challenges or by unemployment, but by the very issues that the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to achieve.
I thought you were going to end with a different question at the end of that setup, which was how do we pay for them? So, I mean, a couple of things. I think first, it's a complicated world. There are so many interconnections between issues, and all of our economies in different ways have a whole series of challenges, as do our societies writ large. The point of this framework is to start to help us think in an integrated way about how to address these issues. We've gone from a world in which too often we pit important things against each other. We can grow, but if we grow, we impinge upon the environment, or we create social inequities that we find are unsustainable. The whole purpose of this is to try to prompt a conversation at all levels about ways that we can shrink or just overturn those trade-offs. I've heard people talk about going from a world of either or to a world of and. And I think we really need to think very carefully and hard about that. Look, the fact that our economies, many of our economies may be facing difficult conditions doesn't mean we're going to stop thinking about the health of our children, the education of our youth, or about the prosperity of our citizens. It may mean there are new challenges, but this is about finding different ways to think about that and to be more imaginative about the policy solutions that we can craft. I'm sure that didn't answer your question, but it was a very hard question.
All right, I will follow up on that. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News, and Ambassador Cousens, we miss you at UN headquarters over here.
Nice to see you.
And nice to see you. I hope you miss us in New York. I will take up, I was going to ask anyway, but I will take up the question to say, how do you pay for it? Which is that across town, one of the goals of this agreement, fingers crossed something comes soon, is to find this treaty or agreement and then also find out how to pay for it. At the same time that the SDGs are looking for money, when you know better than I, at the UN every week there's a flash drive for Mali or refugees, and they're not being filled. So how do you, maybe the private sector, obviously that's a big part of this week, but how do you see, the goals are lofty, but how do you pay for them?
So I'd say a couple things. I think first just to say the goals are not additional to the things that people are doing in their day-to-day lives and in capitals around the world. They're about a way of thinking about the issues and the policy priorities that people are already working on: health, education, growth, jobs, infrastructure, cities, et cetera. So I think the first is to get ourselves out of the mindset that this is about new things that we have to find new money for. That's the first kind of general point. The second is that I think we're in the process of trying to entirely invert the way we think about resourcing development and social goods, and think about ways to create market signals that actually create opportunities around some of the investments that are required, whether that's clean energy, whether that's new infrastructure, whether it's a new way of providing social services. So it's not as simple as going from the public sector to the private sector. I mean, the private sector is all over these issues in every country around the world. It's a question of creating the right market signals so that the way businesses create value actually creates broader shared value. And I think that's part of the story of how you harness, I mean, if you think of the trillions of dollars in the global capital markets, how do you find a way of structuring the policy environment in a way that directs some of that to the sort of goods that we clearly need to achieve?
Are there any questions for Elizabeth? Or yes.
Hi, thank you. My name is Shayna Gallagher. I'm a student at Tufts University and also with Conergy. And so speaking of accountability and pricing as well, something that has been agreed upon, it seems, by a lot of stakeholders from the first day of the COP was that we need a price on carbon. And that is not something that is currently being discussed that I know of within the mechanism of the agreement. And I'm wondering if there is any precedent for that sort of international, somewhat, economically binding agreement in the history of the UN, or whether or not, in terms of reassessing our goals and monitoring over the next couple of years, whether or not that sort of international mechanism could even be possible, considering the agreement that the international community has on that. Thank you.
Well, I think the premise is that you have to move the market and you have to move economies in a way that align with our climate objectives, which is absolutely crucial. There are lots of different ways to set prices. You know, you can set prices nominally, you can set prices de facto in what major movers in the market do in terms of their purchasing power and their own actions. So I think it's a complex issue. It's a crucial one, and the week's not over.
Okay, thank you very much to the audience, and thanks Elizabeth for having been the UN advocate as well on that. And I now will now pass on the floor to the next panel. And Caleb, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Elizabeth.